Okay, we are going to begin with a state of the field talk, and Dr. Jamie Ward is going to come up and give us some information on just where we are now with the field of misophonia. So, Dr. Ward.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to be here today. The Misophonia Research Fund has really revolutionized our understanding and has accelerated our research so much. But over and above that, it really is a forum for different people to come together, from clinicians, people with lived experience, and scientists and researchers such as myself. I was asked to give a presentation on the state of the misophonia field, and I couldn't resist adding in brackets a personal reflection. What this might mean is that some of the things I say you might disagree with, but I'm good with that. This is how things work. It might also mean that I'm wrong about a few things, and that's how science works too. So today I'll go through three broad areas. One is I'll recap where we are in terms of defining and measuring misophonia. There's a bit of a mystery section in the middle called There is More to Misophonia Than Misophonia. And then I will end up by giving an overview of the development of misophonia and its possible treatment. So the definition of misophonia kind of has multiple milestones, if you will. The beginning of this were the Jastroboffs, Margaret and Pavel, who in 2001, 2002 distinguished this as separate from hyperacusis. So hyperacusis is another form of sound aversion that's particularly linked to loudness and particular sounds as well that might tend to be loud. They noticed in their clinical group, an audiology clinic, another group of people who had a somewhat different profile of having strong emotional reactions to a subset, a relatively small subset of sounds, and they referred to them as misophonia. And they proposed in this simple model a different kind of brain mechanism for the two, that hyperacusis is to do with the pathways from the ear to the brain, and misophonia is to do with the high-level cortex involving thoughts and so on, connecting with parts of the brain to do with emotion. And in the intervening years, there was interesting research happening on misophonia, including the first brain imaging studies. But in the last 5 years, the MRF has funded a whole set of research, including an important paper published in 2022 that presents a consensus definition from 17 researchers. So here people come together and they have a whole kind of checklist. People have to decide, is this something that's defining a misophonia or isn't it? So some ideas were ruled out and others were put in. And we can imagine this as a working definition. It's not necessarily going to be true in 10 years' time, but it's where we're at, and it represents our current best knowledge. So misophonia is a disorder of decreased tolerance to specific sounds or stimuli associated with such sounds. These stimuli, known as triggers, are experienced as unpleasant or distressing and tend to evoke strong negative emotional, physiological, and behavioral responses that are not seen in most other people. So that is the key thing that many of you will recognize from your own personal experience. One of the other key things that's happened in the last 5 years is how we measure misophonia. So basically, prior to 5 years ago, the main measurement was clinical judgment. And again, I think clinicians can make these kinds of judgments, but I worry about the reproducibility and the replicability as to how these judgments are made, the transparency of the judgments, and so on. So what we've tried to do as a community is to develop, excuse me, various measures, including standardized interviews and also questionnaires that ask people about to what extent is your misophonia disrupting your study, your work, your family life, and so on, that we would think as being indicative or diagnostic of having misophonia. And there's a variety of measures that are out there. They're all broadly measuring the same thing because they've all been anchored to this, this consensus definition. So they should be, even though there are differences. What we also might have is what we would call objective measures. So an objective measure is something that we might be able to have that measures misophonia without directly asking somebody. And that's why I put a question mark. Is like, to what extent can that ever really happen? So the kinds of things that have happened is brain activity when you're listening to sounds measured with MRI or EEG. People's bodily reactions when they're listening to sounds or certain sounds. You might have a sweating response, your heart rate might go up, or your pupils dilate. We can also look at differences in brain structure that might be characteristic of misophonia. And just to give you one example, this is a study in which sounds were played to people whilst they're in an MRI scanner. And in particular, trigger sounds activated a part of the brain that's called the insular cortex that's involved in emotions and feelings. And you can perhaps see on the graph that the more severe the misophonia, the more this part of the brain is being activated. So these are important steps forward in our research. But what I'd like to do is take a little bit of a reflection as to where this is going in terms of how we measure misophonia. So I'm not going to get you to do a true or false. You can do it in your own head, and I'll tell you where I kind of stand on this. So how are we going to move forward with this? Are we going to just have objective measures? So we might think, well, subjective measures are less reliable than objective measures. Is that really true? Well, I don't think it is true, but it is an open scientific question. So certainly in other fields, what people do is that they take a questionnaire and they give it to the same people multiple times, and they look at how stable or reliable the answers are. And on a kind of a 0 to 1 scale, this is like a 0.7 often in correlation. But you can do similar things with brain activity. You can put somebody in a scanner, get them to wiggle their finger and measure the activity in their brain, and then do the same thing again in another session. And here, if you look at the correlation, it's not always as high as what you get in questionnaires. Now, of course, this hasn't been done necessarily with measures of misophonia, so this is an open question, but we shouldn't just assume that these objective measures are going to be more reliable in this particular sense of the word. What about this idea that eventually we might these objective measures might outperform the other diagnostic measures? And again, I don't think that this is really where the field is going. And the reason for this is that to know an objective measure is working, we calibrate it against the lived experience of that person, the lived experience through an interview or through a questionnaire. So if you're doing that, then an objective measure can never do better than this, because it can never outperform the ground truth, which is that person's day-to-day experience, in effect. So this is why the lived experience is very important, even when we're trying to develop something like an objective measure, because that is the ground truth. So why is it that we're doing brain imaging and other things? And here, I believe it's that objective measures will help to reveal the causes and mechanisms of this. So engaging with the lived experience community is very important, but there are limits. If I were to ask somebody, what's going on in your brain and your body when you're experiencing misophonia? They go, So at this point, we have to pass the baton on from the lived experience community to the scientists. So we want the scientific questions to be grounded in their experience, but the people who are designing these studies are the scientists and the researchers, not necessarily the lived experience community. But the brain generates all of our lived experiences, including those from misophonia. Here's something that really does deserve a question mark at the end, is that we've got these good measures of misophonia, but really are they, what are the limits of them? So most of these measures, basically you would get a score, say out of 0 to 100, and at some point we say people scoring above this have misophonia, people scoring below it do not. But maybe there is something like a spectrum. Maybe there's a group of people who have very severe, extreme misophonia. I don't know what the labels are, mild to moderate and so on. And maybe there are multiple categories, and maybe these have different presentations. Maybe they require different forms of treatment. So there are sub-questionnaires such as the AMISO, which do attempt to divide people into non-binary, you have or do not have misophonia. There are other interesting questions. How do you decide at what point in a continuous scale you say people above this have misophonia? Is it the misophonia community themselves? Is it a clinician who says this person really needs help? Because if you set it too low, then the prevalence is going to be very high, but then you've got a large potential need of people who may or may not all need treatment. Whereas if you set it there, then of course you can focus in on this smaller group of people, less resource intensive, but are you then excluding from treatment and other pathways others? So how will we decide whether there are subtypes or spectrum? I think here we just need to be pooling data from large samples, diverse samples in terms of age, SES, and all the rest, socioeconomic status. We did attempts in our own research to look at subtypes. So we had a large group of people with misophonia, on the misophonia spectrum, however you want to describe this. Now, are there distinct clusters? Here we did find 3 groups, but actually they were defined in terms of mild, moderate, and severe, whereas actually we could have perhaps had other clusters out, misophonia with X, misophonia without Y, and so on. But this didn't fall out in the data. But actually it is still out there. You know, what is the landscape of misophonia other than you do or do not have it? What we also find in our study and other studies is that those at the most extreme end of the misophonia spectrum, if that's what you want to call it, they tend to be more complex. They have more other things going on, such as anxiety, autism, and so on. And those in the middle part of the spectrum have a more simple presentation, which isn't to deny that what they're experiencing is real and intrusive and so on, but it is more limited to the thing in question. So this is where I think we are in terms of defining and measuring misophonia and where we're going to go. This is what I've got, is that there's more to misophonia than misophonia. So here the idea is that misophonia is, to all intents and purposes, a symptom, a kind of pattern of behavior, but it is situated within a personal context and an interpersonal context. So if we take something like a consensus definition of misophonia, what misophonia is and what we think it isn't, this very much belongs there. It has nothing to say really about the personal context or the interpersonal context. It's about this thing itself that we're trying to study. But actually this thing we're trying to study is embedded within a person who might have other differences. So if we take a group of people with misophonia, you're all going to have misophonia in common, because that's how we define you, but maybe you're going to have other things in common. Maybe you're all going to tend to think alike, or have similar kind of emotional responses, or have maybe similar family dynamics. We only know this by putting together a large enough sample. And this is what I mean by there's more to misophonia than misophonia. So in the personal context, I've got your cognitive abilities, your styles, your way of thinking. Do you think in pictures? Do you think in words? Are you very sensitive to a broad range of stimuli? Do you have problems in regulating your emotions? Or maybe you choose to regulate your emotion in one way and not another. So to give an example of my own research, we've looked at sensory hypersensitivity. Here, this is a questionnaire measure. I'll read it to you in case you can't see it. On the bottom, we've got different senses. So we've got vision, hearing is the second one, and then we've got taste, smell, touch, and so on. These were actually parental reports of children. So this graph is from parents of children with misophonia, and they are reporting, yes, they are very sensitive to sounds, but also they don't like the labels in the back of their clothes. They don't like certain smells that others do. It's a broad profile. This does not fit with the definition of misophonia that I've just read. It's not part of that, but it is real. It is statistically there. So it is part of that person's makeup, if you will, in this one. And similarly, we've done this with adults as well, and ask them, you know, what is your experience of things other than sounds, and find that actually they're not like everybody else. They are more sensitive to touch and taste and so on. This is another study that we did, where basically we present people with misophonia sounds. There were 32 sounds, and you just have a rating scale which has things like pain, rage, disgust, hairs on end, headache, and so on, and you just adjust it with this. What you can do with this is that you get a heat map. The red shows that people with misophonia are rating these strongly. And up at the top here, I've just ranked them. These are your worst sounds of crunching chips, chewing gum, all the things that drive you nuts. And the ones at the bottom are less so. And again, this is relatively stable across people with misophonia, despite the fact that the clinical presentation is, this is my trigger sound, and another person says, this is my trigger sound. If you put them together, you find that there is more agreement than you might expect over which sounds are pleasant versus unpleasant. And we've done this again with 150 sounds. So here I present a different way. And again, you can put the worst ones at the top. This is an entirely new sample. But this is just one curious thing that I wanted to highlight. So you've noticed that most of the colors are red, and that means that people with misophonia give higher ratings. There are a few things where it's reversed. When somebody with misophonia is listening to sounds, they report fewer visual experiences, fewer visual images. And we saw this as this kind of blue stripe in the data. So blue just means the data's gone the other way round, that people with misophonia are rating this less. And we find it very strongly again in this 150 sounds. And this is just as strong as the thing we're trying to measure itself, the amount of kind of anger and frustration with trigger sounds. This is a statistically very reliable thing. Again, what does this mean? I don't have a full explanation, but it lies outside of the definition of misophonia. It's not restricted to the trigger sounds. We find it as a broad difference in the way that somebody with misophonia is processing sounds. So it belongs in one of those other bits of the Venn diagram. So just to kind of make a few points about there's more to misophonia than misophonia, what I think this means is that our research agenda should be suitably broad. If all we ever look for is misophonia, then all we will ever see is misophonia. It was just by chance that I put in something about what are your, do you have visual experiences when you listen to sounds? But this is something that is meaningful. If you feel overly constrained to not ask out of the blue exploratory questions, we will never get anywhere. We'll just go round in circles with this definition. The wider profile of misophonia is likely to help us understand how misophonia emerges and is maintained. There are a few other things that kind of follow from this way of thinking, is that when we put someone with misophonia in a brain scanner, then we're not simply seeing misophonia, we're seeing all the other things that go with misophonia that make this person different from others in the population. And we need to find ways of pulling this apart. So let's move on to the development and treatment of misophonia. So the first couple of studies here were done by my colleague in Sussex, Julia Sibner, also funded by the MRF. So in a group of adolescents with misophonia, they were asked about their emotional tendencies here. So they were given scenarios in which they would have to think about and then rate their emotional responsiveness. But this was not asking directly about misophonia. This was asking about their general emotional reactivity. And what we find is that adolescents with misophonia gave stronger reactions to negative emotions such as sadness, but actually they showed no significant difference in this particular study with positive ones. So again, this suggests differences in emotion that go beyond misophonia itself. The second study here was a longitudinal study. So this was a birth cohort study that was done in the UK, where you take 1,000 births and you follow them every few years and give them questionnaires, measures, tests, and so on. One of the tests was a questionnaire, a brief questionnaire about misophonia given at the age of 28. And what you could then do is you could look back through these people's history and find out what were they like when they were a child. And what was found here is that the people who were classed as having misophonia at age 28 reported significantly worse mental health in terms of anxiety and depression at 7 to 10 years. We don't know that they had misophonia at 7 to 10 years because it wasn't assessed. but we do know that there is this link across time between early mental health and a subsequent classification of misophonia. Other research on younger populations is that there's more accommodation, avoiding activities, modifying routines in the families of children with misophonia compared to children who are anxious. Children with misophonia are better, cognitively better on certain things here to do with visual short-term memory. Again, how does that relate to the definition of misophonia? It doesn't, but it's there. It's a reliable difference. And responses to misophonic triggers changes from aggression in young children to self-harm in older children. So we can see a progression here. This is just stepping back and trying to think, well, what would a model of how misophonia developed looks like? And here we've got two models of development. One is change over time, and what is the growth over time? You start off with a little bit of misophonia, and then it grows to a big bit of misophonia, something like this. And of course, in the case of an oak tree, we know that one of these scenarios is true. The seed of an oak tree does not look like a mature oak tree. But is this also true of misophonia? Does the seed of misophonia not look like misophonia? It might look like something else. And what is that something else? What is it going to look like? Is it a general kind of intolerance of sensory stimuli? Is it more in the mental health emotion domain? What is it? So again, this is just coming back to my little Venn diagram, and I didn't intend this as being a formal model. It's just my way of thinking about how misophonia might emerge. The different elements may be right or may be wrong, but I think that this framework of understanding misophonia is going to be helpful. So basically, you've got a rare combination of circumstances, a kind of perfect storm, that there are differences in emotional processing, differences in sensory processing, that are then misophonia kind of emerges from these things. But there are also implications for thinking about it in this way. So if we look for the genetics of misophonia, which we are doing, we will not necessarily just find the genetics of misophonia. We will find the genetics of emotion regulation strategies, the genetics of cognitive abilities. Even things like the nature of your relationships are partly under genetic biases. So we are going to see the genetics of all the things that go with misophonia. And maybe that is what misophonia is developmentally. Maybe there are no genes for misophonia. It's doesn't mean that we shouldn't do this research. It just means that we need to be cautious about what it is we're going to find and how we're going to interpret those findings. What about treatment? So I've drawn on this systematic review of treatments for misophonia that I found to be very helpful. And basically, as of a few years ago, when this was published, cognitive behavioral therapy is by far the most common treatment that's been reported in the academic literature. This involves retraining your thoughts around the trigger sounds, reevaluating what the intentions are of the person who's making the sound. They're not trying to wind you up, and so on. And there is one randomized clinical trial of CBT that found an improvement of up to found a significant improvement, including 1 year after the treatment ended. There are a number of other approaches that have been tried, and a promising one is brain stimulation, where you apply a technique called TMS over the frontal cortex. And again, this seems to be yielding interesting results, but it might not be for everybody. But how would we kind of define these approaches? Well, I think what a lot of people would like, or this kind of maybe slightly naive view of misophonia, is that you could have some kind of laser treatment for misophonia that pulls misophonia out and leaves everything else intact. This kind of very medical kind of way of thinking of misophonia. And maybe that's what people would like, but I'm not sure that it's what they're getting or what they're necessarily is going to work. When we look at things like CBT, also what you're changing here in these kinds of things, or the things around the misophonia, reevaluating your family relationships, thinking about how you could respond differently to the sound. You're not removing it like through some kind of laser treatment. Or similarly, if you're doing something like brain stimulation, there are no regions of the brain that are specialized only for misophonia. So you're altering a circuit that isn't specific to misophonia. It's involved in general cognition, general emotional regulation. And that's the way that things are going. Okay, so to summarize, there's a good consensus over the definition and subjective diagnostic measures. The search for more objective measures will help further our scientific understanding, but I'm personally doubtful that they will act as some kind of surrogate diagnostic tool, except maybe in a few rare instances. We don't know much about how people with misophonia differ one from the other, if indeed they do, except that they almost certainly differ in severity. I'm less sure about whether there are subtypes of misophonia, but again, we will see. There's more to misophonia than misophonia. And a mechanistic understanding will require us to look beyond its defining features and look at all the contributing features or the features that go with it. But it's very hard to disentangle cause and effect when you're looking at an array of interacting things. But this view has implications for how misophonia develops. The seed of misophonia may not look like misophonia, and also has implications for how we treat it, because misophonia exists within a personal and interpersonal context, and it's not some medical thing that you're just trying to cut out. So I would like to thank the MRF for inviting me and for funding all this fantastic research. This is our lab website that I co-created with Julia Sibner, and I'd like to thank you for your time today.
We have time for one or two questions. Are there questions?
Thanks, Jamie. Is this on? I had a question about what you meant by the people who have misophonia, how they experience visual. I didn't quite get. Do they not see when they're hearing sounds? They take in less visually. I didn't understand exactly what that meant.
Yes, it's not quite like that. So if you listen to a sound, then maybe you would have some kind of image of the thing that's creating the sound or whatever. That's how I would imagine it. So they report less of that. So I wouldn't say that it means that their vision through the eyes is necessarily disrupted when they're listening to sounds, although that kind of thing would perhaps happen in terms of an attention reorienting, that they're orienting more towards the sounds. Now, the question is whether or not they could attend or generate images of the source of the sound, and this would be kind of like a compensation mechanism, that they're less in the sound and they're more in the wider context, I guess. So it could be something that they can do, but for whatever reason they don't do.
Thank you. That was really helpful. My daughter is 10 and has misophonia. I'm wondering, and I apologize if this information is elsewhere, how we can get involved in any clinical trials?
Yep, I think that this is probably a question maybe to park for later. So there is no kind of national clinical trial. So there are people working in this sphere who will be enrolling people, but there isn't, as far as I know, a central government trial along these lines. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But there will be opportunities there will be opportunities to contribute to research, and this sort of thing will happen eventually.
And just to add to that, I believe So Quiet may have a list on their website if you're interested in participating. And on the MRF website, we often, and social media will often advertise clinical trials that are open.
Thank you for that excellent overview. I have a question about incorporation of naturalistic neuroscience. Neuroscience itself has shifted in the last I don't know, 5, 10 years, and whether that'll kind of bridge this objective versus subjective divide that you saw?
What do you mean by naturalistic? You mean ecologically kind of valid, or yeah?
Naturalistic situations,
Yes, I see.
audiobooks, movies.
Yes, yeah, that is a gap in our understanding. Is that certainly the research that I've done? We invited people with misophonia into the lab, and we presented them with sounds in controlled, good scientific conditions, and so on. The good reasons why you do that, but of course, there's a challenge to that as well, because that's not how they're experiencing it in daily life. So yes, I think wearable technologies are a very exciting area. I think what you would want to do is not just only measure the person's response. You want to know what's in the room, who's in the room, what are the sounds in the room, and so on. And I think that is a very good way forward for kind of understanding, when misophonia occurs. Yeah.
Hello. So I'm a clinical audiologist who works a lot with decreased sound tolerance, and kind of in where you're seeing research going and what you've seen in the field, how do you feel that audiology or hearing sciences can help support some of our clients here?
Misophonia is, the first definition of misophonia was from audiology, so it's had this very historical grounding. Certainly, I think within our kind of health systems, we don't know where to send people with misophonia, so they go, so a lot will come through audiology. So I think we need to engage with audiologists in terms of information, in terms of what misophonia is about. Whether or not there are easily diagnosable audiological features of misophonia, I think we just don't know. If there are, I don't think it's going to be as simple as hearing loss. But again, we find certainly that standard things like hyperacusis and comfortable loudness levels. They're there in some people with misophonia, but they're certainly not the thing that differentiates it. Of course, there might be more auditory neuroscience correlates of it, whether they're from the brain or the brainstem. There's some evidence that it's from the brainstem, but obviously that doesn't in itself explain misophonia as to why it would be certain sounds and certain contexts and so on. Yeah, follow up.
So with the interventions and stuff, with clinical audiology beyond just devices, that's not all that we do. Do you feel like there's things that we could do as a field to better support our clients in interventions, or is it just referring to mental health, or is there ways we can partner in therapy or rehab with that?
Yeah, I think partnerships are important. So it seems to me that CBT is where things are at the moment, but at the same time, nobody can produce a piece of paper, a study that's actually shown that CBT is better than the kinds of therapy that maybe some audiologists would be recommending. Involve kind of white noise or other sorts of things that you may or may not do. So I would see it's kind of an open space with this, but yeah.
Okay, we want to just make sure if we have any online questions. Okay, we do.
We do have some virtual questions. First of all, are there any pharmacological treatments that have been tested yet for misophonia? For example, like with Xanax or any anxiety medications?
Okay, yes. So when I looked at the systematic review, there was studies with SSRIs, which are the standard treatment for depression and so on, but these tend to be case studies. They're not randomized controlled trials. I just wouldn't feel able to draw any conclusions. If somebody else wants to chip in with a microphone, I'd happy for them to give a more informed answer, but there is nothing that I would rely on basically as good evidence. And of course, a lot of people with misophonia will be on these kinds of drugs. So there is a kind of experiment of nature to be, to be done here, is to document what medication people with misophonia are taking and how their symptoms have changed, irrespective of them being prescribed this for misophonia.
Wonderful. I think we have another question online, and we'd actually like to put up Dr. Jennifer Brout, who will be speaking. So Jennifer, if you would unmute yourself and turn on your
Yes.
video.
Hello. I may have missed the first question. Did we go over the question about occupational therapy yet and sensory challenges in other domains?
We did not.
Okay, so the first question, Dr. Ward, is from an occupational therapist, and they would like to know, they use the sensory processing measure, the SPM2, and they're not finding other areas in addition to auditory that are oversensitive or over responsive. So what would you say to that in terms of your research?
Yep, basically what I would say is that obviously there are differences amongst people with misophonia. We do find on average that people with misophonia are reporting these, but again, it might be specific to certain contexts. It might depend on the severity and the nature of the misophonia. It is something that has been replicated, so I think there is something in it. But there are open questions as to how we measure these things and how we apply it to different subgroups, if there are subgroups.
Thank you. Another question. How do you account for visual triggers? In other words, how does misokinesia fit into this in terms of somebody seeing something like a shaking leg or pacing? How does that fit into your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would relate it to the last question, that basically that there are a wider range of sensory sensitivities, and these examples fit in with that. Yeah, so the leg shaking is interesting because obviously this doesn't have a sound that goes with it. Other things like watching somebody eating silently, that doesn't have a sound, but you can imagine the sound, and I think that that is quite a different mechanism here. So I think there might be different mechanisms depending on the visual stimuli, some of which is to do with the nature of the motion, for example, and others might be to do with the more semantic kind of cognitive association.
So some of the visuals you're saying are associated with the sounds and others are on their own and have to do with kind of repetitive movement.
Correct. I would treat them as two separate likely mechanisms.
Okay. And then there are a few general questions about pharmacology. Is there any evidence that either a benzodiazepine or an SSRI or an SNRI or any of these kinds of things can help with misophonia?
There have been no systematic trials that have looked at this, and I would just see it as an open space that we want to fill in and have a look at. Yeah, but part of me thinks that if these were working in people with misophonia, we might have heard about it. So I personally have some skepticism around this, but I'm a scientist and I would want to see the evidence one way or another.
Okay, another
I think we
question.
have time for one more, Jennifer. Thank you.
Okay, got it. Can you speak to the comorbidity with synesthesias, tactile, auditory, and mirror synesthesia?
Okay, so here these are phenomena where you might see somebody being touched or in pain and you feel it yourself. We know that misophonia might have a different style of kind of emotional processing. We don't know much about the social cognition or the kind of empathy style of people with misophonia. So this is an area that we would want to explore. Certainly it fits in with this idea of, in some kind of very generic way, being more sensitive, where being more sensitive, you could imagine this in the senses, but you could also imagine it in the more social and emotional domain as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for those online questions. Thank you for the questions in the room. And thank you, Dr. Ward.